Hello and welcome to Memory Safe. I'm Dennis Fisher, editor-in-chief of Decipher, and I'm honored today to have Shamla Naidoo as my guest. If you're not familiar with Shamla's work, allow me to embarrass her for a few minutes. Shamla is a native of South Africa and attended the University of South Africa, and in what has become a running theme on the show, decided that being a technologist wasn't difficult enough, so she went to the University of Illinois Chicago Law School. Because why not? She's held senior leadership roles at companies such as IBM and Starwood and is currently the head of cloud strategy and innovation at Netscope. She's also an adjunct professor at the University of Illinois Chicago Law School, an IONS faculty member, and a director and advisor to many other organizations. So I'm not really sure how she had time to talk to me today, but here we are. Shamla, welcome to Memory Safe. Thanks so much for being here.
Dennis, thank you for having me. I'm looking forward to this podcast.
Yeah, me too. It's my pleasure. I'm really happy we're getting to do this. A lot of the podcasts that I do are with people that I know pretty well, but you and I have never met, at least in person. We had a little prep call to make sure that we liked each other. I think it worked out okay. So I'm looking forward to getting to know you, and we'll see how these questions go. Um, they're meant to be sort of fun, elicit a little bit of your background, see how you got where you were, and we'll just kind of go with it from there.
Well, I didn't promise to like you. I'll tell you after this podcast.
I love it. That's perfect. We're off to a great start. This is great. Um, where are you today? You told me you're in a hotel room. Do you want to divulge what city? Because this will be several months before anybody hears about it.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So I'm in Madison, Wisconsin. I have a board meeting here tonight, starting tonight, and then going through the end of day tomorrow. And so I find myself in sunny Madison, Wisconsin.
Sunny. Well, good thing you're there now and not in a couple months when it'll be like light out for about 4 minutes a day and just absolutely freezing the entire time.
Absolutely.
So I mentioned that you're on a few boards and you're an advisor. How do you, before we get into the questions, how do you fit all that sort of into a busy schedule with a full-time job?
So let me tell you how I built my portfolio. So as I was thinking about what my semi-retirement portfolio would look like, I started to kind of build out a set of things I wanted to do. And I'll tell you what guided me. There are two things that I believe in right now. One is I only do work I enjoy, and I only work with people I like. So, those two principles helped guide me into creating a portfolio that's seemingly busy, and it is. But when you're doing work that you enjoy and you're working with people you like, it really is just an extension of personal life. So, I really have no personal life and no distinction of what's a professional or work life. So, realistically, even though I work more hours than I probably ever have, it's work I enjoy doing. And frankly, as I built my portfolio, Dennis, I'm going to tell you something that I probably haven't shared with many people, but I rank ordered the work I do in order of will I do this work if they stop paying me?
Oh, interesting. Okay.
And so, and then of course, at a certain point, you cut off the list, right? Because there's some things you just wouldn't do if people stop paying you.
Right. Sure.
And that's how I kind of put together a portfolio that I believe one makes me happy, two keeps me relevant, and actually fulfills my interest for learning and innovation. Being on the cutting edge of technology, which is important to me. I've had to reinvent myself many times over. And so while I do all these things, it's all things that I enjoy doing, but they also feed each other. So, for example,
Mhm.
I'm a law professor. I teach emerging technology law. I also teach global privacy law. I write my own curriculum. I research my own material. And I then give it to my students because one, I want them to have a fresh experience. I also, create um, research that I can use not only in teaching, but I can take it and apply it to all of my other roles, whether I'm on a board, whether I'm advising someone, whether I'm coaching someone, or whether I'm actually working at Netscope. I take that information and I use it in all of my roles. So everyone gets to benefit from the knowledge I gain. And that's how I built the portfolio. So even though it seems super busy and really chaotic, there's a little bit of method in my madness there.
It's That's a really interesting way of looking at it. I can remember, I don't know, probably about 15 years ago, sitting down with a group of my friends and we all worked together at the time. And we were having almost the same conversation you just described, not a conversation, but your thinking, where we all said, I don't really ever want to have to look for a job again. I only want to work with people I like. And don't like, I only want to do things that really fulfill me. We're lucky to have that kind of options, obviously, but I've never heard anybody describe it quite the way you did, as in a portfolio of things in rank ordering them. And once you get to a certain point, you're like, nope, I wouldn't do that if nobody paid me to do it. So that's out. It's a really interesting way to look at it.
It took a lot of really deliberate and intentional actions to put together a portfolio like that. It also took several years and it just didn't suddenly happen.
Sure.
But, I've been in technology for 41 years. Beginning January, it would be entering 42 years in a corporate job. And so I have had a lot of time to practice.
I was going to say, oh my God.
And so, it took several years to prepare the portfolio and kind of set it in motion and get it to be what I wanted it to be. But it's been rewarding. And as I said, I had enough time to do it.
Yeah. Well, I love that approach. And I hope more people can kind of take that approach if they have the actual options to do that. Because I mean, you said there's not really boundaries between your personal life and your work life, which can be a extremely toxic and terrible thing. But the way that you described it, you're like, look, I do things I enjoy for work, and it's the same as my personal life. It's not like, okay, it's 5:30, work is over here, I'm going to do things I actually like now. Like, well, I like everything. I like all these things. That's why I'm doing them.
Yep.
I love it. Okay. Let's get into the questions. We have 10 questions. I ask everybody the same questions. You might have, you can interpret them different ways. They're all pretty straightforward, but I think you'll enjoy them. So question number 1, when did you get your first computer?
So, interestingly, I worked on a computer beginning in 1983, in January 3rd, 1983.
You know the date.
Yes,
Okay.
that was my first corporate job. And interestingly, I worked on a computer right from day one, but I didn't own a computer until 1986. Frankly, I couldn't afford one. It was
Hmm.
just that expensive. And so my first computer that I touched was in 1983. First computer that I owned and I could control and install stuff for my own use was 1986.
What was that corporate job that you had?
My very first corporate job was working on an IBM computer, including IBM 3741s, which were the terminal, and then IBM Series 1, which was kind of, think about it like if you're thinking client server, the IBM
Mhm.
Series 1 was the machine that actually had the CPU and it did all the work. So you had terminals that were big, giant terminals. You sat behind them, they were the desk, they were not on a desk.
Yeah.
And that was my first job. My first job was a pharmaceutical wholesaler that used the computing system to manage inventory, to decide, what the orders were going to look like, what inventory was going to go down as they fulfilled orders. And really, it created all of those picking lists for people to take it and go pick out of the warehouse, deliver it, and it would automatically, the programs we did, I wrote linear programs at the time, and it would reduce the inventory based on other activities. So that was my first job, was very highly retail, high volume. Everything needed to happen really quickly, because remember what happened back then. If a pharmacy wanted something out of our warehouse, we had to get it out of the warehouse. Somebody would get on a motorcycle to go deliver it because they needed it that quickly. And so this was, high volume
Yeah.
transactions, very retail, but it gave me a whole perspective on compute.
Did you at the time, had you studied computer science? Is that what you wanted to do?
Absolutely not. So
Oh, good.
I didn't pick this career. I kind of fell into it quite by accident, right? So let me kind of share with you a little background. So I get out of high school and I have no money. We're very poor. I don't have money to go to college. So my goal was, let me go find a job. Now, I wasn't yet legally of a working age. So before I actually went to this corporate job, I took a role as a substitute teacher where, the roles were skirted all the time because substitute teachers basically sat in class and helped kids to kind of, behave and be quiet and not be disruptive while the regular teacher was out. And when the regular teacher came back, they would resume normal programming.
Yeah.
Well, I took that opportunity to teach them stuff just because I thought it was interesting and it was fun and I needed a job. So I did
Sure.
that. My first job that I got. So as I was looking for work, I was like, I had no idea how to navigate, the workforce and opportunities. So looking through a newspaper, I saw this ad that said, you know, I forget what the exact heading was. All I can remember is the line that said, no experience necessary, training will be provided.
Hmm.
So I pulled out this ad and I wrote an application. And several weeks later, I got a response. At least I got a phone call, and they called me in for an interview. Well, at least what I thought was an interview. So I go out to this, this building in the big, right in the central business district, big glass building, and I go in, with my little note that says, I needed to be there at 9 a.m. So I go to the front
Hmm.
desk and go, I'm here for this interview. And they said, take a seat, someone will come get you. So at 9 o'clock, a lady comes and she shepherds us all into a room. She looks at this and she's like, everyone who's here for this 9 a.m. appointment, show up in this room. So we follow her, we go into this room, and this room is set out like a classroom. And I had no appreciation for what I was going into. I thought I was going to an interview. Turned out it was an aptitude test. And I was convinced that everyone there was there for some kind of different test. And so I sat there, did my test, there was a pencil on the desk and a workbook. Did my test, turned it in, and left. And, the lady at the desk said, they'll be in touch. Like, okay. So, I'm done my piece. So they'll be in touch. So sure
Right.
enough, they get in touch several weeks later and they call me to a different address this time. And this time it is an interview. So I go in there and I think there were three questions. One was, how will you get to work? Two was, can you start on January, I think it was January 2nd or January 3rd, 1983, because this is like in December.
Hmm.
So, after the holidays. So can you start on this time? And this is how much you will get paid. So this was not an interview. This was here's how it's going to be.
Yeah. Yep.
And so I'm like, okay, thank you. So I march out of there and I get my first job. Have no idea what I'll be doing. Have no idea what the company does. Have, you know,
You didn't
you-
even know what the company was at that
no,
point? Oh
no.
my God. This sounds like the biggest scam in the world, Shamla. It
Well,
really does.
I figured out what the company was when I got there, right?
Yeah.
It was South African druggists, and so this was a pharmaceutical company. I know who the
Mhm.
company is. I'm like, okay, so I go in, do this interview, get the answers to these three questions, and I leave, and I show back up for work on the first working day in January 1983. That's the first time I sit in front of a computer. I'm like, oh, okay, this is the job.
That's crazy. Oh my
Someone taught
gosh.
me everything I knew then, and frankly, everything I know now.
That's incredible. What an amazing story. I mean, it's pretty cool that you you show up at this like sort of you don't know where you're going. It sounds like like an absolute address to like a murder scene or a telemarketing job or something like that. And here you are. You sit down in front of a terminal eventually and learn how to write programs, which is kind of incredible.
Yeah.
And you mentioned it was a few years later before you actually got your own computer. By that time, had you sort of decided like, wow, this is really like there's something here. I really enjoy this.
So I'll tell you, after the first like month or two, I took my paycheck and after settling into, some kind of things of, okay, now I have money.
Hmm.
One of the first things I did was went and enrolled myself in an associate's degree program. And at the time, I thought, well, at least I need to learn enough to be able to do my job well. So I went and picked what we would call back then management information systems,
Yeah.
and I, went to classes at night. So I would leave my work, I would go to classes, and then I would go home. And I did this, for the rest of that program. Um, but I think I got into, after about a year, I got into this little bit of a panic, and I thought, oh my gosh, what if this compute thing doesn't actually take off as we think it is and as everyone seems to think it will? I better figure out a backup plan. Right? so, so I get this associate's degree, and I'm like, okay, what else am I going to do? So if this thing crashes and burns, what else
Mhm.
can I do? And I go in and I register for a 4-year degree with double majors. The one was in information systems, so it had the computer science aspect, it had the information systems, it had all the technical things, database design and all of the technical things.
Yeah.
But I wasn't satisfied with that because I thought I needed a backup career. Like, I'm a poor kid coming out of the slums in Africa.
Yeah.
I better have a backup plan, else my family
Yeah.
is going to not do so. They're going to stop, right? So I'm like, okay, let me go get a backup plan. My backup plan was to get a double major. Second major was in economics because it's the only field I know where people will always be employed. So economics, accounting,
Sure.
microeconomics, macroeconomics, accounting, and there were a few other things I did, statistics and things like that, that fed
Mhm.
that part of the career. But I treated them equally because I knew that I needed to have a backup plan. My backup plan had to be strong, right? And so I was fully prepared to go become an economist or go become an accountant.
Oh my gosh. Holy cow. That's amazing. Jeez. It's like the almost the exact reverse of when I went to college. My dad was an engineer at IBM actually, and so I grew up with, like, IBM computers in my house, and when I went to college, I was like, "Oh, I wanna be a writer." And my dad was like, "Well, that's a great idea. You're gonna make 0 money, and you should have a backup plan and, like, study computer science too." I was like, "I don't wanna do that. That thing's not going anywhere. Who's gonna use computers for the rest of their lives?" Boy, were we smart.
It was, you know what though? I mean, those experiences actually shape how you think for the rest of your career.
It's
Right? And
very
for
true.
me, that backup plan idea was great. And I realized probably after maybe 2 or 3 years that I didn't really need that backup plan because, technology was going to be the future of the world and that I will be employed if I kept myself and my skills current on
Mhm.
the cutting edge of where technology was going. And I made myself a promise that I was going to stay in innovation. I was going to reinvent myself and my skills every chance I got, right? But I'll tell you that that backup career was so valuable, and I didn't realize it until probably 20 years later. When I think about a business problem, I think about it as an economist.
Oh, interesting. In what way? So how knowing absolutely 0 about economics, how would you explain that to me?
I think about the world in supply and demand. I think about the world in, at what point should I cut my losses and do something else? What's
Okay.
what's the what's the opportunity cost of the decisions I make for with the decisions that I choose to not make or the decisions I make differently. And so every single day as technologists, we make decisions about how we spend our time, how we spend our money, what are the outcomes, what are the inputs, what are the outputs, and are the outputs
Right.
worth the inputs, right?
Yep.
And I think, it wasn't until later in my career when I actually started to apply those concepts and principles in much more serious ways. Up until then, it was always, being opportunistic, right?
Yeah.
So when I make a decision, I make a decision based on the P&L. I make a decision based on customers and what customers want. I make decisions on what's good for my team, but what's good for the business and how
Mhm.
to kind of merge all of those to get better outcomes. So I make decisions in a slightly different way, not just as a scientist, right? As a scientist, you make decisions on, black and white. If I add
Cold
this
hard
number and that
facts.
number, This is what I'm going to get. Nothing is going to change that. That's the outcome. And you almost remove the emotion, and you
Yeah.
remove you really you move the economic concepts out of the decision, right? Scientists don't make decisions based on money. They make decisions based on science.
Yes. Yes. Here's a list of facts, and here's what I can, infer from those facts.
Yep.
And that's where we're going. Yeah.
Yep.
That's really interesting. That's fascinating. What a great story.
Yeah.
That is one question out of 10. So, according to that, this podcast will be 4 hours. So, that's what I like to hear. Great answers. Um, okay. So, question number two, sort of related. When did you first go online? So, if you got your first computer in 86,
Yep, 1986.
really?
Because, well, I went online for business before that, right? Because we would have, remember back then we had ISDN lines, right? So you'd
Yeah,
pay for
sure.
internet connectivity for 2 hours each night or 4 hours each night, whatever, depending on what you wanted to do in terms of workload and processing. But I didn't go online for like, random, uh, just searching the
Fun.
internet for things for
Yeah.
fun or like research and looking for things that were just personal in nature.
Mhm.
I didn't do that until 1986, until I got my own computer, because remember also, back then business computers were meant for business use,
Yeah.
and even though there was no way to prevent it, you just didn't do it.
It's so true. It's hard to explain that to anybody that did not grow up in that time. You're just like, no, you just didn't do
You
that.
just didn't
You were
do it.
not doing your Christmas shopping on your work computer. That was not happening.
Yep. Yep.
What was so were you must have still been in South Africa at that time. What was the like connectivity? Was there any sort of online like culture at all at that point?
There was not a very big online culture. I mean, the way we communicated was with email and listservs, right? You would you
Listservs,
would you would
yes.
you would
Yeah.
become a member of a listserv where people were talking about interesting things. So it was all about community. We didn't have, virtual communities. These were, well, I guess they were digital communities, but you knew who the people were because somebody put them in the group and somebody knew everybody in the group. So you wouldn't just make it to a listserv that was just random and general. Over time, I think, after a little while, it became that those communities got so big that people who moderated them or owned them didn't really know everyone who was in the community. So it was, you
Mhm.
all had common interests, but really going online and browsing the way we do today was just not a thing.
No, it's very true. Yeah, the listserv thing is something that is also very hard to explain to somebody, that doesn't have that context. Sort of like the BBS system. You had to know whoever was running the bulletin board to get access to it. Or it had to be a friend of a friend at least. Somebody had
Yeah.
to sort of vouch for you, say, yeah, this person's okay. They're not going to cause a bunch of trouble on here or whatever. Not too much trouble. But yeah, God, that seems like a million years ago. It really does,
Yeah.
but that's because I'm old. Okay. So, um, question number three. What was your first exposure to hacker culture? So you can take the word hacker however you would like to. Positive, negative, whatever you want it.
So my first exposure to hacker culture really was um, somebody who used a guest account to log into a network I was responsible for, to launch a process and launch a um, process to somebody else's computing systems. Right now, back then, nobody changed guest accounts. Nobody changed the admin account. We didn't change passwords. We didn't change the usernames. We had usernames and passwords that came in a manual, and you always used the same username and password, or else you might break your system and not be able to get into it again.
That's right.
Also, if you upgraded your system, and the next admin came in after you and needed to upgrade the system or do some maintenance work on it, they needed the credentials.
Right.
So we credentials were hard coded. They were in a manual. They were printed, and people just didn't change them. We just didn't have to until this particular incident. I'm on call, and I get a call from someone that says, "I have somebody from Japan who wants to talk to you." Like, okay, so I get on the phone, and because it's my night on call, like somebody's on the other end, like yelling, like really mad.
Oh boy.
What are you doing in my system? Because they had traced back the process to my network. Right? Every network had an ID. They traced it back to my network. They made the call. Somebody who was working 24 by 7 um, realized they needed to call me. I was the on call person. And somebody had used my system to launch access to the environment.
Oh wow.
And so I had to figure this out. And I was like, okay, well, I can tell you that it's 2 o'clock in the morning. I am not logged in. And if I am not logged in, nobody is logged in.
Right.
Right?
As far as you
Unless,
know. Yeah.
as far as I know, nobody's
Yeah.
logged in unless it's an automated process. My automated processes are all done given the time of day. So if it's not me, it's nobody. So let me go look. Pull out my terminal, I connect. And sure enough, there is my guest account that's logged in with an active
Mm.
process.
Uh-oh.
That was my introduction to hacker culture. And now, how do I go recover from that? How do I go investigate that? How do I figure out what to do so it doesn't happen again? So you have to find the vulnerability, you have to figure out how to strengthen the vulnerability, you have to close off the vulnerability, then you have to understand it, document it, um, prevent it from happening again. And more importantly, here's me. I'm a system admin or system manager. We called us then. Had full access to systems. I
Yep.
now have to go explain this to people of more senior, levels, as what
Yep.
happened, why it happened, how it happened. And that was my introduction to how to harden systems.
That is a great story. I love that. Do you remember what kind of system it was? I'm sure you do.
I absolutely do. It was a DEC Alpha system.
Oh, kids, go look that up. That is Google that right now. Anyone younger than us listening to this, which is probably everybody.
One of those systems that had the best security that you could ever have, right? And so I was sad when the company who acquired the company and acquired the technology shut it off. One of the most secure systems. And guess what? It was the most rudimentary, basic service that caused the vulnerability.
Oh, really? Do you recall like what you had to do afterwards to sort of clean it up? I don't know what the cleanup process was like, but
Well, interestingly, it wasn't like a hacker today, right? Today, they're highly disruptive. All that individual wanted was coming from a competitor, wanted to know what that company was doing. So all they wanted was a place to launch their access from so that they didn't get discovered as the person poking around the system. They were looking for IP, and there was IP there for sure. So
sure.
it was the competitor. So they just used my system as the launching point to hide their identity, or at least they thought they might hide their identity. So they weren't being disruptive. They were more just being curious and poking around, trying to get trade secrets of sorts. And, so what did I have to do to clean it up? Of course, to figure out, oh, okay, so tomorrow night, I'm going to have the same person or someone else like them log into my guest account because everybody used the same password.
Yeah.
Right?
And
Same
once they
username,
knew it,
password,
then
once they
yeah.
knew it, right?
Hmm.
And they all got it. It was in the manual, it was hard coded, it was printed, right? You didn't change it. So first thing I had to do was to figure out, how do I change the password? And then how do I make sure that the password is, shared with those who need it? The new
Hmm.
password is shared with those who need it. And then, we had to kind of create process. And I'll tell you, that's when we used to write the pass. We started a process, or I started a process to write the username and the password in an envelope and seal it, and then put it in a safe. When somebody else needed it, they would pull out the envelope, tear it open, use it. They would have to then change it, put the new username and password in an envelope, seal it, put it in the safe. It was
Oh
that
my God.
elementary.
Wow. That very early password manager, password vault, like literally a password vault.
Yep, absolutely.
That's wild. That's very cool. So did you actually was there any sort of consequences from it aside from, any sort of negative aside from like, well, shit, maybe we should have changed this password earlier?
Well, interesting, there were no consequences because nobody was changing usernames or
Eh,
passwords. Nobody was
Right.
changing any of it. So no, there was no consequence other than, oh, oops, okay, well, let's make sure this doesn't happen again.
Yeah. That's a great story. I love that. Okay. Question number 4. When did you think you might make this, whatever this is, a career? Computing, security, whatever it happens to be.
So interestingly, that kind of gave me an entry into um, my technology career and what can go wrong. What happened now is, 20 years later, so I'm an engineer, but I'm just doing my engineering job with an eye and a lens to security, making sure that the systems I built, the programs I wrote, the
Mhm.
networks I designed were all done in a secure way. So I'm just doing my job in a more responsible way, if you will. And so 20 years later, I'm like, what are these people talking about? All the security stuff. And my thought was, well, let me go figure out what they're trying to do. And I realized I understood the subject matter probably better than most simply because I was doing it for longer.
Yeah.
And I thought, I'm going to jump on that bandwagon because by this time, I had 2 CIO roles. I was like, I think I'm going to make a switch, go to cyber because security was offering a lot more upward mobility. There was a lot more money there. There was a lot more visibility there. I was like, yeah, I think I can do that. I understand the subject matter. Okay, I'm in. And so I started a cybersecurity career.
That much. How long ago was that?
That was in, I would say, 1998, toward the late part of 1998.
Okay. So sort of in the middle of the dot-com boom era when, yeah, people were starting to figure out like there should be some security around all this crap that we've built. Maybe we need people to do that.
Yeah, I think it was kind of creating a more formal career path,
Yeah.
but it was also separating security from the typical engineering technology functions.
Yeah, I think that's right. Because, I mean, a lot of the folks I know who are roughly our age who are in the security world, a lot of them started out with the same sort of background you have, sysadmins or just a network admin engineer sort of catch all job. You were responsible for the network, whatever that meant. Like, you know, keeping it running, keeping people out of it, letting the right people in. Nobody talked about that as security back then. It was just what an admin did. And then when security became a viable thing, everybody sort of looked at it, I think like you did, and said, that seems like it might be kind of fun. There might be something there.
And it was fun for a while. I
For
will
a
tell
while,
you that
not
right
anymore.
now, it's a great time to be a former CISO.
Oh my. You could not be right. I've never been a CISO, but I know a lot of them. And the ones I know who are still CISOs, they don't really sleep at all. Like, no matter what company they work for or, you know, how many people work in their company, they are just balls of stress all the time. Yeah.
Yep.
Former CISO sounds like a great job. Excuse me. Okay. Question number 5. We actually sort of covered this, but the question is, what was your alternate career path if you were going to have one? So, econ- economist, I suppose.
Economist, accountant.
Yeah. So you're not going to do that in retirement. It sounds like you've got more interesting things to do than that.
I do. You know what? That's my baseline for everything else I do today. Just making better decisions. But no, I don't plan to explore that career.
Do you think you would have been good at it? I know that's kind of a weird question, but do you think you would have enjoyed being, say a corporate accountant?
I don't think so. In hindsight, as I look at that career, I realize that it would have been too constrained for me because innovation is in my DNA. Doing the same things differently is what I do. Reinventing things, making, looking to the future versus looking to the past
Hmm.
is something that comes so naturally to me. And life will not be exciting or fun if I couldn't look to the future and prepare and plan for the future. On the accounting side, I think that so much of it is so structured
Yeah.
that there's no room for innovation, there's no room for creativity. You have to do what you have to do and, you know dot every I, cross every T.
Yep.
And it's a necessary role. I understand its value, but frankly, there are many other people who can do it.
Yeah.
I just
It's
don't want to.
no, I don't either. It's like I'm terrible at math, so it was never an option. But I have two good friends who are accountants, and both of them are just they're the exact people you just described. Like everything needs to be in its place. And, and they look at a spreadsheet or at books and it just makes sense to them. I look at that and I'm just like, that's a bunch of numbers. I don't know what you're even seeing there. I have no idea how to make any of that make sense. But for them, it's just like they find joy in being able to put things in their right places and all that kind of stuff. That
You know how I think about that? I look at every problem like a Rubik's cube. An accountant will look at everything as a two-dimensional chart.
yeah. Yes. And that's why they're good at it. But my brain does not work that way at all. It's kind of amazing to me that you were able to sort of get through those studies, even though your brain is sort of like, I need some room. I need to be able to create.
You know what's interesting is when you actually go into this and you think, this is going to be the career, this is going to be what's going to feed my family and feed me and kind of prepare me for a life that's better than the life I had,
Hmm.
um, you'd be surprised at what you can do when you are inspired for the outcome. Because I wasn't thinking about, did I enjoy this? Should I enjoy this? It wasn't not, enjoyment and fun and exciting was not part of the equation. It was, I'm preparing for a career. And so I'm going to, put my head down and get it done. And so that's what I did.
That's a great point because it's a very sort of privileged way of looking at things, the way that I just described it. Like, oh, do I enjoy this very great job? Well, maybe not. I'll do this other very great job. Like, yeah, if it's your opportunity to go make yourself a better life, then yeah, you put your head down and like sheer force of will, you do it. Like this is what I'm going to do
Yeah.
because it's my best opportunity. Yeah. Great answer. Okay. Question number 5. I'm not sure how well this will apply to you, but we'll see. Who is your hacker hero? It could be now, it could be somebody you met. They don't even need to be in security, just somebody that sort of you look up to for doing things their own way.
I have learned a lot from a lot of hackers. I'll tell you, one of the first books I read on hacking was The Cuckoo's Nest.
I,
And
you
so
described, I'm sorry to interrupt, but the thing that you described where the hacker got into your the whole time I'm thinking cuckoo's egg, cuckoo's egg, cuckoo's egg. The whole time.
so interestingly, so I don't have a hacker hero. My gosh, I want to strangle every one of them. But I think that the lessons they teach are very, very important and interesting, because really, when you understand how hacker think, it helps you to not be caught flat-footed.
Mm.
It helps you to understand like how to think about where they might come at you next. And so I don't have a hacker hero, but certainly I think that generally speaking, they have a lot to teach.
Yeah, I agree. So you mentioned the cuckoo's egg, which is one of my all-time favorite books. My dad had that and I read it when I think I was probably in high school when I read it. And it's still one of my favorites. I've probably reread that book more than almost any book in my life. Um, had you read it when the incident happened to you or did you read it later?
I read it later. It was a couple years later,
Okay.
and it was when I was on a mission to figure out how can people disrupt the technology I'm responsible for. And it all made sense. I think I might have read my copy 18 times, and I was really sad to leave it back in South Africa when I moved to the US.
One of the things that I've tried so hard over the years to interview that author, Cliff Stahl, and I know somebody that got to interview him, I don't know, maybe a year ago. He's very reclusive. He doesn't really talk about that at all. He like makes glass bottles now, which kind of amazing. But it's one of the things that I've been trying to do for 20 years and I've never gotten it done. But that story is amazing for anyone that hasn't read that book. Like go get that book and read it. It's still the lessons in there are still relevant right now in 2023 for sure.
Again, it's the foundational knowledge for this hacking culture you were describing earlier. And, if you want to know how hackers think, that was the beginnings of people documenting how they think.
Yeah. And it's also just somebody who was clearly very smart, but wasn't, uh, he was an astronomer, I believe, or astrophysicist he was studying at the time, and happened to be a Unix sysadmin at night to make money, and just unraveled this puzzle bit by bit by himself, essentially, with some help along the way. But and most of the people didn't believe him at first. It's such a great lesson in sort of perseverance and trying to figure things out from context clues, and why is this person trying to do this, and how are they thinking on the other side of the world, why are they trying to get into my system, what's in it for them.
And how can they monetize this?
Yeah, which at the time I believe it was Russian espionage, it was Soviet espionage. They were just trying to steal. I forget who the actual target was, but it was some defense contractor, I believe. But yeah, how can they make money off this? What's their end goal, right? And it sounds like that's exactly what you had to figure out too. Why is this person using my guest account?
Yep. Yep.
Yeah, that's funny. What a great parallel. I love it. Okay, along those same lines, what's your favorite hacker movie? So, could be things like war games or, whatever it happens to be.
What I enjoyed a lot was Mr. Robot. It was, not it was a deep story, a very complicated story, but I actually thought it had all the bits and pieces of what we all wrestle with every day. Like as CISOs, you wrestle with all of this every day, like multiple personalities, multiple people coming at you different ways, and from day to day you don't know what they're thinking, you don't know what they're trying to accomplish. Sometimes you're guessing, sometimes it was a very deep and complicated movie, and I think the character was just complex
Yeah.
but interesting. And it took it took a little bit of kind of thinking and connecting the dots to really get the grip on the plot, but I really enjoyed it. I really did.
There was a lot of twists and turns in that show. I remember the first few episodes, I was like, oh, this is really cool. Hacker culture on the screen. You're seeing stuff that you kind of know about. And then it sort of got into the, well, wait, is this person real? Like, what's happening in this guy's head? There's all kinds of weird shit happening here. And it was fascinating. And I know that there's a bunch of people in the security industry that worked on that show as consultants, and sort of, you could tell because they did things, little details. You're like, oh, somebody knows what they're doing, told them how to write this, or, how they would approach this problem.
Interestingly, you say that. That was my exact words. Somebody here knows what they're doing, because
Yeah.
it wasn't random, and it was the kinds of things we were dealing with every day on the ground.
Yep. Yeah, it's
Mhm.
exactly right. And that's what made it so good, I think. It's not just like, oh, this is a cool story. They're like, oh no, these are real problems. And these are how defenders approach these problems.
Yeah.
And this is how attackers think.
Mhm.
Okay. Question number, I think 8. We'll go with 8. How do you describe your job to somebody? Say you meet somebody at a cocktail party, or meet them for the first time, and they say, oh, what do you do for work?
I tell people I'm at the tail end of my corporate career. I have a portfolio of jobs, I have a portfolio of things I do, and then I describe the portfolio.
So exactly the way you described it to me at the beginning.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And then if they sort of dig deeper and say, well, okay, what's your 9 to 5 job? What do you do every day?
Yeah, then I will dissect, depending on the audience, depending on where they come from and what network they might be in.
Yep.
If I'm talking to public company board directors, then I will describe that part of the portfolio first, and then all the others. If I'm talking to professors or academics, then I will talk about my being a law professor and what I do there, and then I'll talk about the rest as secondary roles, because I do so many different things and they're
Hmm.
vastly different from each other. If you're looking at it cosmetically, when you actually dig deeper, you'll realize that the roots are common.
Yeah. I think that's a really good answer. I do sort of the same thing. If somebody I met for the first time asks me what I do, I use sort of context clues to see how I'm going to answer. Like if I'm interested in talking to that person, I'll say, oh, I'm a writer. And they'll say, oh, what, because somebody will say, "Oh, what do you write? What kind of stuff do you do?" If I'm not really interested in talking to them, I'll be like, "I work in technology." I'll be like, "Oh, cool," and you, just, that's the end of the conversation. You don't really have to talk to them anymore. But if you have, so if one of your students, for example, in your law class says, "What are you doing on a daily basis? Like, are you just a manager? Are you solving technology problems? How is it? Are you talking to customers?"
And the way I would describe that, if somebody was curious, I would describe that in terms of purpose, right? I've spent 41 years in a technology job trying to make companies better, trying to
Mm,
help them to leverage technology to get better outcomes, faster outcomes, and add to that, to your digital approach to accelerating your outcomes,
mhm.
you have to also provide enough security to protect those outcomes. That's how I would describe it to somebody who didn't really know or understand either the cybersecurity job or the technology job. Bringing that together, because as you increase your use of technology, you increase your portfolio of technology assets. All of them are subject to theft and disruption, etc. And you need to focus on the security as you take the benefits of the technology, that the technology value that your organizations might actually um, utilize.
Yeah, it's that's very true. Are they teaching cybersecurity law in law? Like, is it a core thing, or is it sort of? I don't know if there are electives in law school. I have no idea.
So for a long time, the technology topics were electives.
Okay.
And students can pick and choose. When I was in law school, I would pick and choose what I wanted to add into my elective portfolio.
Hmm.
Now, I was an advisory member to faculty on this topic, and we talked about it. You cannot practice law if you don't understand technology.
Yeah.
One, you're using it. Two, you're litigating it. And three, every one of your customers is going to be using it. So, as you think about this, it was foundational to everyone to learn and understand enough technology. So we then made my class, which is called Technology and the Law, and it talks about, policy positions, litigation. It talks about specific use cases for where technology appears, and how people are using it, and then what can go wrong with how they're using it that might
Yeah.
actually create obligations and opportunities for litigation. And so those classes are now mandatory, so everybody who goes through the law school program will at least touch some of the technology topics. And my class in particular was one of those required classes. So just like you would do property law or contract law, you end up doing technology law and policy. And you really need to understand how technology fits into the bigger legal picture, both from a utilization perspective but also from a litigation perspective.
Oh, good. That makes me feel a little better. You know, it's at least they're trying. They're getting into it a little bit. That's good. Okay. Question number 9. This is sort of a two-part question. What's your proudest moment and what was your biggest mistake? This can be career-wise, it could be whatever, however you want to answer. It's up to you.
Yeah. So I'll start with, so my proudest moment. It's not just a proudest moment. It is not a moment. It's my pride in what I do, is in the people that I develop. And so one of the proudest things I have is, as I look through, my network, and I look in LinkedIn and I see how many of the people who worked with me, for me, in my teams, either were coached by me, mentored by me, sponsored by me. I look at that and I go, I watch their career, and I measure that by how much progress they've made determines how successful I have been as a leader. That's my measure of success. My biggest regret, maybe, is when I think about my career and I go back, 40 years, in that time frame. I remember writing my own firewall software. I wrote my own firewalls using scripts because I was a developer, I was a programmer,
Yeah.
using scripts, using my editor, using my programming languages, using the logic that I learned. And I wrote my own firewalls to make sure that when people were coming into and connecting to my network, that I knew who was allowed and who was denied. right? And so using all of the, I know who's in my building, I know who's in my network, I know who's an endpoint on my network. So yeah, they may be allowed, but everyone else is coming in was denied because I had that early experience and I knew that in addition to just changing the passwords, that was not enough. I needed to make sure that when my internet came up, that people who weren't allowed there should be blocked right at the entry, right?
Yeah.
And so when I look at that, one of my big regrets is why didn't I think about being an entrepreneur then? Why didn't I think about, creating a product out of this, or at least getting enough conversation in the community to doing it? And I've had a lot of those opportunities, right? So that was one, but it was so early on I could get beyond that. But I will tell you that, fast forward 20 years later, and I was the head of security and architecture for a company, and I created my own application security function. So it didn't wasn't software necessarily, but I said to a developer, I said, I'm going to hire you, you're an Oracle developer. I'm going to hire you, and you and I are going to work together on the use cases for what we should be looking at when developers write code. So they give us their code. What should we be looking for that tells us whether this code is written securely or not?
Yeah.
Where are the vulnerabilities? And let's figure that out. And so we started doing it, one, manually. And I'd say to him, like, you go ask for 100 lines of code from every developer, and then you look and you see who can we trust to be really good, secure, focused developers, and who
Yeah.
should we actually help with getting a little bit more learning and a little bit more, education, etc. And so we did all of this manually. And then before we knew it, a company who I talked to about this created a automated product to do this. And that was great, except that, sometimes I wish that I had the forethought to be an entrepreneur, to actually bring those opportunities and solutions to the market. It would have been highly lucrative, I think.
I think so too. Yes. Yeah. I've heard similar stories to the firewall one that you told me. Other people of our sort of generation, they're like, "Oh yeah, I just wrote something like that," and then 5 years later, it was a $50 million business for somebody else. You're just like, "Crap." Yeah, but
Yeah.
I mean, that's sort of the way that things went. In the '80s, '90s, you had to sort of create your own tools, right? Like they just didn't exist in the marketplace.
Yeah. There were no tools. We were
Right.
the tools.
Yeah.
And then we
Excellent.
all looked for easy ways to get our job done, right? So rather than me, coming in every day and doing some manual checking, let me just write a script that will run overnight and give me the report in the morning. And
Hmm.
that's how we did technology, and that's how we did security.
Yeah, it's very true.
Yeah.
Okay, you've made it to the end. Last question. What's your best or maybe favorite piece of security advice?
I have many, but if I had to give you just one, it would be the subject matter for what you're trying to secure. There's too many governance people. There are too many people who would, pick out a risk and then try to tell you what to do about it
Hmm.
when they have never understood or actually owned or did the work that they're asking you to do. So I tell people all the time, if you want to be a security expert, be an expert in the subject matter first, not in security, but in the technology that you're trying to secure. That makes you a whole lot more credible. It
Yeah.
also allows you to walk a mile in the shoes of the people who you're telling, what to do. So let me give you an example. If you're an application security, whatever person, resource professional, and you try to tell a developer how to make their code secure, and you've never written a line of code in your life, you have not earned the right to tell those developers how to do their jobs.
Yeah.
And so that's the piece of advice I would give people is, be the expert before you try to tell the experts how to do their jobs.
I love it. That's I couldn't agree more. I've run into many of those people, and I am certainly no kind of security expert, but I know enough to know that I what I don't know. And I've run into those people. I'm like, well, were you a developer? Like, how did you? No, no, I just sort of got into this. I'm like, oh, okay, great. I'm going to go over here now. I don't. Yeah, that's really smart, and I don't think there's enough people that sort of take that approach, um, and especially you know as generations go on, there's not as many people that grew up the way that you did, having sort of the basic experience of running an entire network and then becoming a developer and then becoming a security person and then a CISO and, everything else you've done. Not everybody's going to have that sort of background, unfortunately.
You know what's interesting? I tell my law students this. If you're going to litigate a subject matter, you better at least understand it. So if you come to my class and you want to go litigate artificial intelligence or blockchain or whatever you want, whatever you want to litigate, let
Yeah.
me teach you the subject matter and then I'll teach you how to litigate it. But if you don't learn the subject matter, all you can do is to talk from a perspective of theory. So let me give you some knowledge. Knowledge is power.
Yeah. Theory's nice, but you're right. Knowledge is power. I love
Yeah.
it. Okay. Last bonus question. Bonus question. This one's easy though. Do you have any questions for me?
Tell me why you do this. Why do you do this podcast?
It's to get to talk to interesting people like you. Honestly, that sounds like an extremely patronizing answer, but the thing that I tell my kids, my friends, anybody that will ask me, like, what do you love about your job? A, I get to write every day, which I love. But B, I get to talk to really smart and interesting people every day who have really interesting backgrounds and great stories that I've never heard before. Like your story's great. Your background is really super interesting. It's completely different from, my circumstances growing up. The many of the stories you told me today are just amazing. I loved it. But yeah, I mean, selfishly, it's because I want to learn from really smart people like you and get to talk to, different, interesting people every day. And it's a ton of fun.
Thank you for sharing that, Dennis. I appreciate that.
Yeah, of course. Shamla, thank you so much for coming on. I truly enjoyed it. It was a lot of fun. And hopefully one of these days I'll get to see you in person. It would be great.
Absolutely. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Thank you.